Thanksgiving always looked better from a distance. From outside the dining room window, our family probably appeared warm, close, and uncomplicated. There were 20 people crowded around two long tables. The smell of roasted turkey filled the house. Children moved between rooms carrying paper plates of dessert. Inside, things were more complicated. My father stood at the head of the table carving the turkey. From his perspective, this was a room built by sacrifice. 30 years of long work weeks, missed weekends, financial risks, responsibilities nobody else had carried. As he cut through the turkey, he looked around the room and saw evidence that his efforts had been worth it. Children, grandchildren, a family gathered together. What he didn't see was how differently some of us remembered the same years. I sat halfway down the table, listening to conversations drift from sports to travel plans to old family stories. The moment began so casually that nobody noticed it at first. Someone asked my father about a difficult period our family had gone through years earlier. He laughed softly, then he started talking. At first the story sounded familiar, the financial pressure, the stress, the uncertainty, but gradually the details shifted. The emphasis changed, and before long the story wasn't really about hard times anymore. It was about blame. My father paused with the carving knife still in his hand. You know, he said, a lot of those problems started because certain people made choices that put the family in difficult positions. The room grew quieter. Several relatives looked up. I knew where this was going before anyone else did. My father glanced toward me, not angrily, almost casually, which somehow made it worse. I spent years cleaning up situations I didn't create. The knife touched the cutting board, a sharp sound. I don't think everyone appreciates how much responsibility that placed on the rest of us. Nobody spoke. Across the table, my mother looked down at her plate. My cousins exchanged uncertain glances. Most of the younger relatives didn't know enough family history to understand what was happening. The older ones did. And they suddenly became very interested in their food. From my father's perspective, he was finally telling the truth, a truth he had carried for years, a truth reinforced by memory. The problem was that memory can become selective, especially when pain is involved. I felt the familiar pressure to remain silent. I had spent years doing exactly that, not because I agreed, because arguing with family history rarely changes it. People become attached to the versions of events that help them live with themselves. My father continued. The story grew simpler, cleaner. Every complication disappeared, every shared responsibility faded. By the end, the difficult chapter of our family history had been reduced to one explanation, one person, me. The silence around the table became uncomfortable, not dramatic, heavy. Then another voice entered the conversation. That's not exactly how it happened. Everyone turned. The speaker was my uncle Robert. My father's older brother, a man who rarely interrupted anyone. For decades, he had been present for nearly every major event in our family. If anyone knew the history, it was him. My father looked surprised. Robert set down his fork. You've repeated that version long enough that I think you've started believing it completely. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Robert wasn't angry. His tone was calm, measured, which made it impossible to dismiss. He looked around the table. I remember those years. Then he looked directly at my father. And I remember you asking him to make those decisions. My father blinked. Robert continued. I remember the meetings. The room stayed silent. I remember the financial discussions. Another pause. And I remember that when things worked, everyone shared the credit. The words hung in the air. When things didn't work, responsibility somehow became his. My father opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared on his face, not because Robert was attacking him, because Robert had been there. The authority didn't come from personality, it came from first-hand knowledge. Several older relatives slowly nodded, small movements, quiet confirmations. Pieces of history began returning to the room, details people had forgotten, or perhaps chosen not to revisit. I finally spoke, not to defend myself, just to add context. I never believed everything that happened was your fault. My father looked at me, the tension in his face shifted slightly. But I spent years wondering why it became entirely mine. Nobody interrupted. The conversation wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The truth often arrives quietly. My father stared at the table for a long moment. I could almost see him sorting through old memories, trying to separate facts from feelings. Trying to determine where history ended and resentment began. The answer wasn't obvious. Perhaps it never would be, because Robert was right about one thing. Pain changes memory. It edits, rearranges, simplifies, sometimes without permission. Eventually dinner resumed. Conversations restarted. Children laughed in another room. The world moved forward, but something had changed, not because my father had been defeated. He hadn't, not because I had won. I hadn't. The change came from something smaller. For the first time, the family was no longer operating from a single story. There were now multiple truths sitting at the same table, some overlapping, some conflicting, all incomplete. Later that evening, as people prepared to leave, my father stopped beside me. Neither of us apologized, neither of us argued. He simply said, maybe I don't remember everything as clearly as I thought. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even agreement, but it was honest. And sometimes honesty is the furthest a family can travel in a single holiday.